The small room was quiet, not the kind of quiet that invited attention, but the kind that made you almost forget it existed. Sunlight filtered softly through the half-open blinds, falling in thin lines across the worn wooden floor. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of light, catching for a moment before settling again. Chairs were scattered around the edges of the room, some old, some newer, all mismatched. A few tables stood pushed against the walls, cluttered with papers, pens, and a forgotten coffee cup that had dried into a dull stain. In the corner there it was, the piano. It was an old upright, chipped in places, the keys uneven and some slightly yellowed with age. It looked ordinary, almost invisible, as though it belonged more to the walls than to the room itself. Most people who came here didn't pay it much attention. They came for meetings, classes, small gatherings, or just to pass time. The piano was there, always, but no one really noticed it. And certainly no one noticed her. She sat quietly near the piano, her back straight but relaxed, hands folded in her lap. She was small, unassuming, and quiet. When she entered a room, it was easy for people to forget she was there. She never sought attention. It wasn't that she didn't want to be noticed. It was more that she didn't feel the need. She had learned long ago that people often didn't see her. They looked, maybe, but they never really saw. Her name was never called aloud in meetings. She was rarely invited to speak first, and she often found herself at the edge of conversations, listening more than talking. She didn't mind much. She had other worlds inside her mind, worlds filled with sound, rhythm, and melodies that no one else could hear. She had learned to fill her quiet life with music, to let the keys beneath her fingers speak the words she rarely found the courage to say. Today, like most days, she sat in the corner, watching the small group of people gathered for a workshop. They chattered and laughed, their voices blending into the ordinary background hum of the room. A few glanced her way briefly, but it was the kind of glance that skipped over her, a glance that barely noticed her presence. She didn't move. She didn't respond. She just observed, letting the soft light fall on her face, her eyes tracing the patterns of dust in the air, her mind wandering. Her gaze often drifted to the piano. Its keys called to her silently, as though aware that she was listening. Sometimes she touched them gently, just a note or two, almost without thought. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper of music that blended with the room. Nobody heard it, nobody cared. That was the way it had always been, and it suited her perfectly. The piano was her friend, the one companion that never judged, never laughed at her mistakes, and always responded to her touch with honesty. She thought about the first time she had played in this room. It had been years ago, but the memory was vivid. She had been younger then, unsure of herself, timid in every way. A teacher had suggested she try the piano during a small event. She had hesitated, hands shaking over the keys, heart pounding with nervousness. And then she had played. She didn't remember what piece it was, but she remembered the feeling. The way the music seemed to rise from her fingers, filling the space before anyone could even realize it. For a moment, the room had been quiet in a different way, a quiet that listened. She had caught a few surprised glances, people leaning forward as though they were discovering something hidden in plain sight. But just as quickly, the attention drifted away, and the room returned to its ordinary hum. It didn't matter. She didn't need applause or recognition. The music had been enough. But today felt different. There was an event planned, a small gathering where people would speak, share, and perform. She had been asked, almost reluctantly, to play the piano for a few minutes. She hadn't expected much. People rarely remembered the piano, and even when they did, it was usually just background noise. She smiled faintly to herself. Maybe this time would be the same. She would play, fill the room with her music, and nobody would notice. That was fine. She had long ago accepted that her world and her music existed mostly for her, and that was enough. She rose slowly and walked to the piano, the old wooden floor creaking softly beneath her feet. Her fingers hovered over the keys, familiar and comforting. The crowd's chatter continued around her, a dull hum she barely registered. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat align with the rhythm of her thoughts. She let her hands find their place on the keys naturally, without force, without expectation. Then, almost without realizing it, she pressed the first key. The note rang out clearly, sharp and clean, cutting through the background noise. A few heads turned slightly, curiosity flickering for a moment, but the attention was fleeting. They didn't expect anything remarkable, just another soft background sound to fill the room. She smiled faintly, almost to herself. Let them not notice. Let them think it is ordinary. That was how it should be. But as the next notes followed, something began to shift. The melody was soft, hesitant, but it carried a subtle depth, a feeling that seemed to grow with every passing second. It was not just music. It was emotion, memory, and longing poured into sound. She didn't think about what she was playing. She didn't calculate or plan. She simply let the music flow, as she always did. Her fingers moved with a quiet confidence, each note a part of a story only she fully understood. Slowly, the room began to change. Conversations faltered. A hand paused mid-gesture. A few people stopped shuffling papers or looking at their phones. They heard the music now, really heard it, and it was different from anything they had expected. It was not loud or flashy. It was not showy. It was honest and real, filled with feeling that seemed to resonate with something deep inside anyone willing to listen. The notes lingered in the air, weaving through the room, wrapping around the people who had barely noticed her just moments before. She kept her eyes closed, letting the music guide her, letting it speak the words she didn't say. Memories of quiet mornings spent practicing alone, of small moments of triumph when she had mastered a difficult piece, of evenings spent dreaming of a world that might one day see her talent. All of it flowed into her playing. She didn't need the room to notice. She had played enough in her life to know that the music itself was enough. Yet, for reasons she could not explain, she felt a flicker of something as she sensed the room's change. A faint awareness, a quiet attention, like the room itself was leaning in, holding its breath. The people in the room felt it too. They didn't speak. They didn't move. Even those who had been talking just moments before now sat still, eyes wide, ears tuned to the piano. Some felt a strange stirring in their chests, a pull of emotion that was sudden and unexpected. They looked around, almost to confirm that others were feeling it too, and found themselves not needing confirmation. The music had captured them, even though they had barely noticed it before. It was no longer just a piano, and she was no longer just a quiet presence in the corner. She had begun to speak in a voice far louder than words, a voice that demanded attention without asking for it. And yet, she remained almost unaware of it herself. She did not play for recognition or applause. Her eyes were still closed, her focus inward, on the story she was telling through her hands. Each note carried a piece of her life, each chord a reflection of her hopes and fears. The room, which had seemed so ordinary and forgettable just moments ago, was alive with sound. The air itself seemed to vibrate, carrying the music into every corner, touching every person present in a way that made them pause, think, and feel. When the first piece ended, there was a moment of silence so profound that it felt heavy. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, as though afraid to disturb what had just been created. She lifted her hands slowly, as if waking from a dream, and looked around. For the first time, she saw them. Not just the people, but their faces, their eyes wide with surprise, their mouths slightly open, their expressions reflecting a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had noticed her. They had really noticed her, and she felt a strange warmth, a gentle affirmation that she had not expected, yet deeply needed. It was a small moment, a beginning, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that even in a room where people barely noticed, even in a life that often went unseen, there could be moments where the world leaned in to listen. The piano, worn and chipped, had spoken louder than anyone imagined. And she, quiet and unassuming, had found her voice. The room would soon return to its ordinary rhythm. People would talk, laugh, and move on. But the memory of that sound, that moment, would linger. And for her, it was a A beginning that promised that perhaps, just perhaps, the world could hear her, if only for a little while. She sat back, letting her fingers rest on the keys, breathing in the quiet that followed. The sunlight still fell in soft lines across the floor. The room seemed the same, yet different. Something had shifted, even if just slightly. And she, for the first time in a long time, felt the thrill of being seen, of being heard, without saying a single word. The moment after her fingers lifted from the keys, the room seemed to hang between two worlds. People shifted in their seats, their eyes wide, still processing what they had just heard. The chatter that had filled the space earlier was gone. Even the usual hum of movement and restless sighs had paused, as though the air itself had decided to listen. She took a quiet breath, letting her hands hover over the keys for a moment longer, not quite ready to stop, not quite ready to release the connection that had formed between her and the piano. Her heart was still racing, the kind of pulse that comes after something unexpected, something real and alive. It was not fear. It was excitement, a gentle thrill that warmed her chest from inside. She had played before countless times, but there was something different about today. Something in the way the room had changed, the way the people had responded, even if silently. She felt it. This time they were paying attention, even if only for a moment. Slowly, she began again, her hands finding the keys naturally, moving with an ease born of years of quiet practice. She did not play loudly. She did not force her presence into the space. Her notes started soft, almost hesitant, delicate whispers that rose and fell with an invisible rhythm. She played as she had always played, letting the music carry itself, letting it speak. And in doing so, she noticed the room had changed. The people who had barely looked her way before now sat differently. Shoulders leaned forward. Eyes that had wandered now fixed on her. The atmosphere had shifted imperceptibly, a subtle tension of curiosity and wonder, waiting to be filled. Her first melody was simple, not showy or dramatic. It moved like water over stones, gentle and persistent. Each note flowed into the next as though the piano itself remembered her touch, remembering the small rehearsals, the lonely afternoons, the nights when the world had been too loud for her to find peace anywhere else. She closed her eyes, letting the music guide her, letting it tell the story she could not yet put into words. Her body relaxed into the chair, shoulders loose, arms and fingers moving fluidly. For a moment, she felt weightless, as if the room, the piano, and the people all melted into one shared presence of sound. The people in the room were no longer just a group of individuals. They were part of the experience, drawn in by something they could not name. They shifted in their chairs, leaned slightly forward, and one or two even leaned against the walls as if the music had anchored them there. The first note had been a spark, a quiet invitation, but now the melody spread, filling every corner, wrapping around them, touching something deep inside. Some of the listeners did not even realize they were holding their breath. Others felt a lump in their throats, unprepared for the emotion that had quietly arrived. She did not see them. She did not need to. Her focus was on the piano, on the story unfolding beneath her fingers. She let the music take control, letting her life, her memories, her hopes, and regrets flow into every note. There were soft pauses, moments where she seemed to hesitate, and yet those pauses were part of the music too, drawing the listeners closer. It was not perfection in the technical sense, but it was perfect in truth. That authenticity had a way of speaking louder than any loud note ever could. The room began to breathe with her. The subtle changes, the quiet movements, the small reactions, tilted heads, widened eyes, lips pressed together, were all signs that something had shifted. The people who had been indifferent now felt the pull of the piano. It was no longer background. It demanded attention without demanding words. The music carried a message, a feeling, a life that they could not ignore. Even the smallest gestures told her story. She noticed the way one older man's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair, almost unconsciously, a sign of rhythm that had caught him. A young woman's eyes glistened, and she tried to blink it away, embarrassed at her own reaction, yet unable to turn away. She let her mind wander as she played. She remembered sitting in empty rooms, practicing for hours, the sound of the piano echoing against bare walls. She remembered the moments when she thought no one would ever hear her, when the world would continue on, completely unaware of the music growing inside her. And yet, here she was, and somehow the world had paused, even if just for a moment, to let her speak. That thought made her chest swell quietly with something like hope. She played another melody, one that carried a weight heavier than the first, a deeper resonance. This time, the notes were stronger, more confident. They did not shout, but they demanded presence. The room responded. A few people leaned forward so far it was almost as if they were trying to touch the sound. Others simply sat frozen, eyes locked, unwilling or unable to look away. For the first time, she realized her music could do something beyond filling a room. Could move it, shape it, make the invisible visible. And still, she did not look at them. She did not need their validation. But she could feel it, the change in energy around her. It was subtle but undeniable. The people who had barely noticed her before were now listening. Really listening. They were awake. And that was enough. That was all she had ever wanted. To be heard, if only for a moment, for someone, anyone, to truly feel the music she carried inside. A few notes into the next piece, she noticed a small boy in the corner, probably no older than 10. He had been fidgeting with a notebook, drawing little doodles with his pencil, clearly bored and restless. But now he had stopped. He sat perfectly still, eyes wide and fixed on her hands. His pencil lay forgotten on the table. She smiled faintly, though she did not open her eyes. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Children, she thought, often had the clearest ears, the kind that could hear truth without judgment. And for this boy, the music had found its way straight into his heart. The room itself seemed to vibrate with the sound, though no one acknowledged it aloud. The walls, the windows, even the sunlight streaming through the blinds appeared to hold the music in place, letting it linger longer than it normally would. It was as if the entire space had become a living, breathing instrument, amplifying the life she poured into it. And the people inside, who had been talking, laughing and moving without care just moments before, now leaned toward the piano, pulled by an invisible thread of melody. Her playing shifted once more. A change in tempo, a gentle rise and fall that suggested movement, journey, and discovery. It was no longer just notes. It was emotion, stories, memories, and dreams woven together in sound. She thought about the mornings spent waking before anyone else, practicing quietly, perfecting the tiniest details that nobody would ever notice. And yet, all of that work, all those quiet hours had built up to this moment. And now, the room, which had barely noticed her at first, was completely captivated. She did not see it yet, but she could feel the tension around her, a kind of anticipation. The music had become a bridge between her inner world and the world outside. She could sense it in the way people leaned in, the way they held their breaths, the slight quiver in a hand or the catch of a throat. Every note carried weight, and every silence between the notes was just as powerful. People were no longer passively hearing her. They were experiencing her. At one point, she glanced at the corner of the room and saw a man, middle-aged, usually brisk and impatient, sitting perfectly still, eyes focused on her hands. She had seen him many times before, moving through the space with little thought, interacting with no one longer than necessary. And now he was captivated, as if for the first time he had noticed not just the piano, but her. The realization made her smile quietly. It was subtle, but it mattered. Every single person she touched with her music mattered. Time seemed to stretch in that room. Minutes felt like hours and hours felt like seconds. She did not notice herself sweating or breathing hard. She only noticed the sound, the flow, and the life that moved through her fingers. Each chord told a story. Each melody spoke a language beyond words. And gradually, slowly, the people around her began to awaken to it. They began to move, not in distraction, but in quiet acknowledgement. A few leaned slightly forward, some tilted their heads, others closed their eyes, letting the sound fill them. By the time she finished the second piece, the room was transformed. It was no longer just a collection of people and furniture. It had become a living, breathing space, alive with emotion, sound, and attention. People looked at her now, really looked, and for the first time she felt the full weight of their awareness. It was overwhelming, but not unpleasant. It was recognition without words, validation without applause. It was acknowledgement in its purest form. She lifted her hands slowly from the keys, letting the final note linger in the air. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of presence. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The room had become a vessel, holding everything she had poured into it, everything she had carried alone for so long. And in that stillness, she realized something important. She had been noticed. She had been heard. And it felt like the beginning of something new. She opened her eyes slowly, letting them adjust to the soft sunlight that filled the room. The moment she touched the keys again, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A rhythm that seemed to pulse beneath her fingers, as if the piano itself was alive and waiting. She did not think about the notes or the melody. She only felt them. Each chord, each pause, each gentle rise and fall of the music seemed to carry more than sound. It carried a story that had been waiting for someone, anyone, to hear it. The room, which had already been quiet, became almost sacred in its stillness. Every sound outside the piano faded away. The chatter of voices, the rustle of papers, even the creak of chairs seemed to disappear. It was as if the music had drawn a boundary around them, a bubble of emotion and presence that demanded attention. And this time no one could ignore it, not even those who had been indifferent before. Her fingers danced across the keys, not quickly, but with precision and confidence. Each note lingered longer than usual, carrying a weight that was impossible to dismiss. There was passion in the subtle shifts of tempo, in the quiet crescendos, in the pauses that allowed the sound to hang in the air. It was not a performance meant for applause. It was a voice, one that had been trapped for years, now freed and unstoppable. She played not for herself, nor for recognition, but because the music had to speak. She noticed the way the people in the room were responding, even without looking at them. There was a shift in the air, a quiet tension of anticipation and wonder. A man sitting near the back had his hand over his heart, eyes closed, as though holding on to something he had long forgotten. A woman near the window leaned forward slightly, breath caught in her chest, unable to move but unwilling to turn away. Even the small boy from earlier sat perfectly still, completely absorbed. The music had reached them. It had found a way into each of their hearts, even if they could not explain why. The melody grew richer, deeper. It spoke of long nights spent alone, of quiet struggles, of dreams and fears she had never shared. It spoke of moments when the world seemed too loud, too demanding, and she had turned inward to find solace in the piano. Now, that solace was no longer just hers. It belonged to the room, to the people who had barely noticed her, to those who had never understood the quiet strength it took to keep going when no one was watching. She could feel the music filling every corner, wrapping around the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and the people. She had played in small, empty rooms before, but never like this. Never with an audience that seemed to awaken mid-performance, as if the piano had become a voice that could not be ignored. There was no arrogance in her playing, no desire to show off, just honesty. And honesty had a power that forced attention. She glanced briefly at the man who had been sitting with his hand on his heart. He opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream, and looked toward her. For a split second, their eyes met, and she saw the reflection of surprise, awe, and an emotion that was hard to name. It was as though he had never really noticed anyone before, and now he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. She did not look away. She kept her gaze gentle, allowing the music to carry the words her eyes could not say. The small boy in the corner had begun to tap his fingers lightly on the table, mirroring the rhythm she had created. She smiled faintly, though she did not stop playing. Children had a way of feeling things before adults could process them, and it was clear he had understood something profound. The others began to shift too. A woman who had been leaning back in her chair now sat upright, leaning forward slightly, as if trying to catch every note before it could escape. The energy in the room was alive, electric, charged with emotion, and it all moved through her fingertips. She thought about all the times she had doubted herself, all the times she had wondered if anyone would ever hear the music inside her. The piano had been a friend, a teacher, a companion that never judged, never criticized, never laughed. And now, for the first time, it was more than that. It was a bridge between her world and theirs, between silence and recognition, between loneliness and connection. She played with a quiet intensity, letting every note carry the weight of her life, her struggles, her joys, and her longings. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, a woman near the door let out a small sigh, almost involuntarily. It was not audible, but the sound of it mingled with the music in a strange, subtle way. She noticed it, though she did not stop. Every reaction, every movement, every tiny change in posture was part of the performance now. The room had stopped being ordinary. It had become a living, breathing audience, responding not to spectacle, but to truth. As the music rose and fell, she allowed herself to feel the emotion fully. She did not hold back. She let it pour from her, unguarded, raw, and honest. Her hands moved faster at times, slower at others, each note chosen not for perfection but for meaning. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about telling a story that had existed quietly in her life for years, a story that the world had overlooked, that the room had barely noticed. And now it was impossible to ignore. A man at the back, who had been skeptical, arms crossed, face stern, now leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on her hands. He did not say a word. He did not even blink for a long moment. And yet, his presence, his attention, was part of the music too. She felt it. Every person who had doubted, every person who had overlooked, every person who had assumed she was just another quiet face in the room. She was speaking to them, through the piano, without a single word. The music became louder, but not harsh. It filled the space, wrapping around them all. It was as if the room itself had become a chamber for sound, amplifying not just the notes, but the emotion behind them. Some people closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them, tears brimming in their eyes that they tried to hide. Others simply stared, unable to move, caught in a spell they could not explain. The music spoke for her, spoke for them, spoke for all the things left unspoken in the quiet corners of life. She thought about her past, about the times she had sat alone, practicing for hours, feeling invisible. The piano had always been there, but the world had not. And yet, every note she played now carried the weight of those invisible hours, giving them form, giving them voice. She felt a strange lightness in her chest, as if the years of unnoticed practice and quiet perseverance were finally being recognized, not with applause or words, but with attention, with presence, with feeling. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into something fluid, undefined. She did not care if anyone noticed the passage of time. She only cared about the story she was telling, about the room that had begun to lean in, that had begun to breathe with her, that had begun to respond to her truth. She was no longer playing for herself. She was playing for them, for the people who had never truly seen her before, for the small boy in the corner, for the skeptical adults, for the ones who had doubted, and even for the ones who had not cared. Her final notes approached, not a grand finale, but a quiet landing. She slowed, letting the music fade naturally, like the last breath of a sunset. Each note lingered, stretching into the space, refusing to be ignored. The room held its breath, caught in the afterglow of what had been created. People looked at each other, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, as though they were witnessing something impossible. She lifted her hands from the keys slowly, almost reluctantly, savoring the final vibration in the air. And then she saw them, really saw them, in a way she had never experienced before. Their eyes were fixed on her, not with judgment, not with expectation, not with casual curiosity, but with awe, with wonder, with something deeper she could not name. It was recognition without words. Validation without applause. They had heard her. They had seen her. The piano had spoken, and the room had listened. A quiet hum of conversation began to rise, tentative and careful. People shifted in their seats, leaning back slowly, still absorbing what had happened. A few whispered softly to each other, almost in disbelief. Some wiped away tears they hadn't realized had fallen. She smiled faintly, feeling a warmth she had never known in a room full of strangers. The music had done more than fill the space. It had reached the hearts of those who had barely noticed her before. It had moved them, and that was more than enough. She closed the piano gently, hands resting on her lap, and took a deep breath. The moment was fleeting. She knew, and the world would return to its ordinary rhythm soon enough. But she had spoken and they had listened. And that, she realized, was the beginning of something she had never allowed herself to imagine. The quiet corners of life, the unnoticed hours, the long nights spent in solitude, they had led her here, to this room, to this moment, to this recognition. She rose from the piano slowly, letting her fingers linger in the air as if reluctant to leave the sound behind. The room, still vibrating with the echoes of her music, felt different now. People who had barely looked her way before were leaning slightly forward, eyes soft, smiles shy, hesitant, but genuine. They had felt the power of something real, something that transcended noise, distraction, and indifference. They had felt her, and she knew, without a doubt, that nothing would ever be the same again. The room had returned, in some ways, to its ordinary rhythm. People shifted in their seats, whispered softly, and began to move around again. But nothing was truly ordinary anymore. Something had changed, subtle yet unmistakable, and it was not just in the space. It was in the people themselves. The quiet girl who had sat unnoticed for so long now held their attention in a way that words could not explain. She had played and they had heard. They had seen her, and she realized, for the first time, that recognition was not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it was quiet, lingering in the corners, like sunlight on dust. She closed the piano lid gently and rose, her movements deliberate, almost shy. She felt a strange awareness of herself, a consciousness she had avoided for years. The attention was not threatening. It was not prying or demanding. It was curious, admiring, respectful. People were noticing her in a way that was new, and she was learning how to breathe in that attention without fear. She had imagined moments like this before, in quiet dreams, but the reality was far more powerful than any imagined scene. A woman who had been sitting near the window approached her first. She was careful, gentle in her steps, as though afraid to disturb the fragile moment that had just passed. "That was incredible," she said softly, voice trembling slightly. "I've never heard anything like it." The words were simple, yet they carried weight. Simple acknowledgement, honest and unpretentious, felt heavier than praise shouted from a stage. She nodded, smiling faintly, unsure how to respond. She did not need to explain. The music had already done everything words could not. Others began to follow. The small boy from the corner stayed seated, but his eyes shone with excitement, and he clutched a notebook tightly, scribbling something furiously. Perhaps he was trying to capture a memory of what he had just felt. An older man, usually stern and unapproachable, now lingered near the piano, looking at her with a kind of awe that was rare on his face. People who had been indifferent, even dismissive, moments ago now lingered with quiet curiosity. It was as if the music had left a small mark on each of them, a mark that would not fade quickly. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. She had never played for attention. She had never sought it. And yet, here it was, not forced or demanded, but given freely, honestly, in response to what she had shared. She realized in that moment that recognition was not about proving yourself. It was about being authentic, about letting the truth of your heart flow through your hands, through your voice, through your presence, and trusting that the world, in its own time, would notice. A man, middle-aged, who had seemed impatient and skeptical throughout, finally approached. He cleared his throat and smiled. A genuine, hesitant smile that seemed almost impossible for him to give. "I didn't expect that," he said simply. "I didn't expect anyone could play like that. I'm sorry I didn't notice you before." The words were awkward, but sincere. She nodded, letting them settle between them. Apologies were not necessary. What mattered was the moment they were sharing now, the acknowledgement that had finally arrived. Her eyes drifted around the room. People were talking quietly now, but differently. They spoke in low tones, animated but respectful, sharing their impressions, pointing out particular notes or passages they had loved. There was no envy, no comparison, no dismissive laughter. There was only connection. The music had created it, had carved a small space where people could respond not with judgment, but with appreciation. She felt a new understanding forming inside her. That talent was not only about being seen, it was about moving others, quietly, profoundly, without demanding it. A few people lingered near the piano, asking questions softly. "How long have you been playing?" one asked. Another, older, said, "Where did you learn to play like that?" She answered simply, not because she felt the need to impress, but because she wanted to share just a little of her story. "I've been playing for years," she said, "mostly alone, practicing, listening, learning." She smiled at the simplicity of the words. It was not a story of extraordinary achievement or fame. It was a story of quiet dedication, of persistence, of a love for something that had never required attention until now. The small boy raised his hand hesitantly. "Can you teach me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She smiled, a gentle, warm smile, feeling the joy of being asked to share what she loved. "Yes," she said softly. "I can show you a few things." It was a small moment but significant. Sharing her gift had never been part of a plan. It had always been personal, private. But now, she felt the quiet thrill of connection. The knowledge that her music could inspire, even guide, someone else. She noticed others who had been skeptical, those who had barely paid attention to anything beyond their own lives. They were leaning in now, listening, smiling, even laughing softly at the beauty and simplicity of the melodies she played. The room was changing, not because it had to, but because the music had demanded it gently and powerfully. People were no longer passive participants in their own space. They were present. They were engaged. They were alive in a way that only happens when something real touches them unexpectedly. She paused for a moment, letting her hands rest on the keys. The piano had carried her through the morning, through the stories she had long kept inside, and she realized that what had begun as simple practice had transformed into something larger, something shared. She looked around and saw the wonder in the faces of strangers. She saw the curiosity that had replaced indifference. She saw the respect that had replaced skepticism. And she knew, quietly but firmly, that she had crossed a threshold. It was not fame. It was not applause. It was recognition of a different kind. Recognition that she existed, that her presence mattered, that her voice, though quiet for so long, could resonate with others in ways that words never could. The piano had spoken for her, and it had been heard. And in that hearing, something fragile but powerful had formed. A bridge between her world and theirs. A woman who had been sitting at the back of the room all morning now approached her. "Would you consider playing at the community recital next week?" she asked, hesitating, unsure if the invitation would frighten her. "People need to hear you. They need to see what you can do." She blinked, surprised by the offer. She had never thought of playing in front of a larger crowd. The thought had frightened her before, but now, after what had just happened, she felt a flicker of confidence, a quiet willingness. "Maybe," she said softly. "I'd like that." Other people nodded, smiling, encouraging her. She realized that opportunities she had never imagined were appearing because she had been willing to share something genuine. It was not ambition or performance that had created this moment. It was honesty, authenticity, and the courage to play without expectation. And the realization was both frightening and exhilarating. She had taken a step she had never dared before, and the world had responded kindly. She returned to the piano, allowing herself a few more quiet notes, a soft melody that floated across the room. She played not to impress, not to perform, but to enjoy the sound, the feel of the keys beneath her fingers, the connection that had formed. She watched as the boy tried to imitate a simple rhythm she had played, laughter bubbling from him quietly as he struggled and succeeded. She felt a small spark of pride, not in herself, but in the shared moment, in the joy that music could create beyond her own experience. People lingered longer than they normally would, reluctant to leave, even as the morning moved toward its usual end. Conversations flowed naturally, no longer fragmented by disinterest or distraction. Some people asked for advice, some for stories, some simply for another piece to listen to. She offered quietly, with patience, sharing what she knew, guiding hands, showing small techniques, and encouraging effort. In doing so, she realized that her quiet life, once so private and solitary, could touch others in ways she had never expected. By the time the room emptied, she sat alone with the piano, a soft smile on her face. The sunlight had shifted, now falling across the keys in long, warm lines. The echo of the morning lingered in the air, not as sound, but as memory. She realized that she had not only played for herself, or even for the room, but for a small awakening in people's hearts. She had moved the unnoticed, the indifferent, the skeptical, and turned their attention toward something genuine, something that mattered. And she understood something profound. Life could change in quiet ways. Recognition did not have to shout. Opportunities did not have to arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, all it took was honesty, dedication, and the courage to share what had long been kept inside. The piano had done its work, and she had done hers. The room had been transformed, but more importantly, she had been transformed. She had crossed a threshold from invisibility into acknowledgement, from quiet presence into visible impact, from solitude into shared experience. The piano remained, old and worn, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The room had seen her, the people had felt her, and she, for the first time in a long while, had begun to believe that she could move the world in ways that were quiet, subtle, and yet deeply profound. The week passed quickly, almost too quickly. She had played in the quiet room many times before, but now each day felt different. Every step toward the piano felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of years spent unnoticed had been lifted. People had begun to recognize her presence, to seek her out, to ask questions about the music that had once existed only in her solitude. And though she still carried the quiet reserve that had always defined her, there was a new confidence growing inside her, subtle but undeniable. When the day of the community recital arrived, she felt a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. She had never imagined performing in front of a larger crowd, and yet the thought did not frighten her the way it might have before. She remembered the faces in the small room, the wide eyes, the quiet amazement, and she realized that the piano had prepared her for this moment. It had given her the courage to trust herself, to trust the music, and to trust that those who listened would understand, even if only for a moment. The hall was larger than the small room she had played in before. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, people talking quietly in anticipation. The stage was simple, with only the piano, a microphone for announcements, and a few chairs for the audience. The space felt vast, almost intimidating, and she felt a flicker of doubt in her chest. But as she approached the piano, setting her bag and sheet music aside, she took a deep breath and remembered the quiet mornings, the long afternoons of practice, the countless moments when only the keys and her own heart had witnessed her dedication. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingers. And then she began to play. The first note echoed through the hall, soft and pure, a single sound that demanded attention. She did not rush. She did not force the melody. She let it rise naturally, letting the music speak the way she had learned it could. Slowly, people began to settle, hushed by the sound that filled the space. The melody moved gently, wrapping around the audience, touching each listener in ways they did not expect. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, mouths slightly open in surprise. Others closed their eyes, allowing the music to sink into their hearts. With each note, she felt herself becoming part of the music, and the music becoming part of the room. There was a dialogue, unspoken, between her and the audience. She could feel their attention, their emotions, their quiet admiration. And though she did not see their faces in detail, she sensed the shifts, the tiny changes that revealed their connection to her performance. The hall was alive, not with noise, but with presence, and it carried her playing further than any room she had known. As the first piece continued, the melodies deepened, richer and more complex. She allowed herself to pour her life into the music. The lonely afternoons, the quiet struggles, the moments when the world seemed too large and she felt invisible. The piano had always been her refuge, but now it was her voice. Through the music, she spoke without words, revealing her heart and soul to people who had never known her story. And they listened, truly listened. A small boy, seated near the front, mirrored some of the movements she made with his hands, tapping lightly on the armrest in rhythm. His eyes shone with delight and understanding, and she smiled faintly, though she did not stop playing. Children had a way of feeling things deeply, sensing truth in ways adults often missed. She felt honored that the music could reach him, that it could spark a small light of joy and curiosity in his heart. The audience responded in subtle ways. A woman near the back shifted slightly in her chair, leaning in as if she could feel each vibration of the notes. A man who had looked distracted at first now sat still, fingers folded in his lap, eyes wide, captivated. Some people wiped away tears they had not realized had fallen. Others whispered to themselves in wonder, as though the music had unlocked memories or emotions they had long buried. The room had become more than a hall filled with chairs and walls. It was a living, breathing space, carrying every emotion that the piano released. She moved seamlessly into the second piece, allowing the tempo to rise and fall with the natural rhythm of her heart. The music was no longer just sound. It was narrative. It told stories of resilience, of quiet victories, of the courage found in solitude. She did not think of applause, recognition, or fame. She only thought of truth, of sharing what had always lived within her. And in doing so, she realized that the audience was not just listening. They were feeling, remembering, and connecting with her in a profound, unspoken way. At one point, she glanced briefly toward the audience. Faces she could not name, eyes she could not count, all fixed on her hands, on the piano, on the expression that had become part of the music. She felt a warmth in her chest that was unlike anything she had known. Recognition had arrived not with fanfare, but quietly, profoundly, through the honesty of her playing. People had seen her, truly seen her, and it had changed something in both her and them. The music swelled, carrying the crescendo of emotion that had been building quietly through the first two pieces. She did not try to control it. She let it rise naturally, letting every note, every chord, every pause carry the weight of years of unnoticed effort, of long practice, of silent dedication. She felt the energy of the room, the subtle shivers of awareness running through the audience, and she knew that the music had reached them. It had touched them in ways that words never could. A woman seated near the aisle whispered softly to the person next to her, barely audible, "I've never heard anything so real." Another leaned forward, hands clasped together, eyes glistening with emotion. Even the skeptical man from the back, who had looked unconcerned at first, now had his hands resting gently on his knees, his gaze fixed, his mind captivated by the honesty of her sound. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was her voice, her truth, her presence made tangible. She transitioned into the final piece, slower, more deliberate, each note measured, each chord infused with intention. She allowed the music to carry the weight of the stories she had lived, the quiet victories she had celebrated alone, the moments of doubt and hope that had shaped her. The room seemed to lean in collectively, holding its breath, giving space for the sound to resonate fully. The audience was silent, not out of fear or indifference, but out of awe, respect, and an understanding that this moment was extraordinary in its quiet honesty. Her fingers danced across the keys in a delicate rhythm, the sound filling every corner, every listener's heart. She felt each emotion, each memory, each small triumph flowing through her fingertips, and she realized that this was the culmination of all the years she had spent practicing in silence. Every lonely evening, every unnoticed effort, every quiet morning alone with the piano had led her here. And now the world in this hall was witnessing it, not just seeing the piano but seeing her. As the last notes faded, a profound silence followed. It was not awkward. It was not empty. It was full of presence, full of emotion, full of acknowledgement. People slowly exhaled, some with tears still glistening, others with smiles that could not be contained. Applause began softly, almost tentatively, then swelled as more and more people joined. It was not the loudest applause she had ever heard, but it was sincere, heartfelt, and overwhelming in its meaning. She allowed herself to stand, bowing slightly, acknowledging not just the audience, but the journey that had brought her to this moment. After the performance, people approached her. Some offered compliments, some asked questions, some simply shook her hand in quiet gratitude. A few children lingered, wanting to try the keys themselves, wanting to feel the music in their own hands. She guided them gently, showing small techniques, laughing softly when mistakes were made, and celebrating each tiny victory. The experience was more than sharing music. It was sharing connection, understanding, and the quiet power of persistence and dedication. A woman who had organized the event approached her, smiling warmly. "You have a gift," she said softly, "and you share it in the most beautiful way. Have you ever considered teaching, performing more, or even composing? People need to hear this, not just today, but every day." She nodded, realizing for the first time that her music could extend beyond herself. It could touch lives, change hearts, inspire, and move others in ways she had never imagined. The thought was overwhelming, but exciting, full of possibility. As the hall emptied, she lingered, sitting at the piano, letting her fingers trace the keys softly. The sunlight now streamed through the windows in long golden beams. She thought about the journey, from quiet rooms where no one noticed her, to a space filled with people who had truly listened. She thought about the small boy, the skeptical adults, the curious faces, and felt a quiet pride. Not pride in recognition or fame, but pride in perseverance, honesty, and the power of music to connect. And she understood something that had always been true. Being unnoticed was not the end of a story. It was a chapter, one that built resilience, depth, and understanding. The piano had been her companion, her voice, her bridge, and now it had become a way to reach the world, to touch hearts, to inspire and connect. She realized that this was only the beginning. Opportunities, connections, and experiences would come, not because she demanded them, but because she had remained true to herself, to her music, and to the quiet strength that had carried her through the years. She took one last breath, her hands resting on the keys, eyes closed for a moment. The journey that had begun in a quiet room, unnoticed by the world, had led her to this hall, to this recognition, and to a place where her music could live beyond her own experience. The piano sang loudly, yes, but it was more than sound. It was a voice of authenticity, resilience, and connection. And she knew with a calm certainty that it would continue to speak, wherever she chose to play, whoever chose to listen, and for as long as she was willing to let it. She rose slowly, leaving the hall with a quiet smile, carrying with her the knowledge that her music, once unnoticed, had found its way into the hearts of others. She had crossed a threshold from quiet existence to visible impact, from solitude to shared experience. And as she walked into the sunlight, she felt the freedom of a life transformed. Not by chance, not by recognition alone, but by the courage to play, to share, and to be herself.